Good afternoon and welcome to the D23 Fund Basic Training session today. It will be led by Liz Schultz and Carleen Hancock. And at this point, I will go ahead and turn it over to Liz to get us started this afternoon. Liz?
Thank you, Julie. Hopefully everybody can hear me okay. Feel free to type in the chat if you've got any questions as we go. We have a lot of material to cover with you today, but we want to make sure we're providing useful information. So if you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat at any time, and Carleen and I can help answer those. So today we've got the D23 Fund Basic Training. We're scheduled for 2 hours for this training today. I want to say good afternoon to everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. I know sometimes it's hard to carve out some time, but I think we've got some good information to share with you on D23 funds. So to start us out, I'd like to start with a little bit of an introduction. My name is Liz Schultz. I am the SFMS Senior Operations Analyst. I've been with DAS SFMS for about 5 years now, but I've been working for the state of Oregon for almost 15. SFMS is the statewide financial management services unit. So we use the acronym SFMS a lot. That is the statewide financial management services unit. We also use SFMA a lot. That is the statewide financial management application. So our unit supports and ensures accuracy and accountability in the state government financial systems. We provide services and controls in the management of SFMA, and part of our responsibilities include establishing and maintaining certain statewide SFMA profiles like the D23 Fund profile that we're going to talk about today. So from our SFMS team, Julie's here monitoring the chat. She'll let us know if you've got any questions so we can make sure to address them. We also have Carleen Hancock. Carleen is responsible for processing D23 fund requests. There's Carleen, and she's going to be presenting some of the slides later in this presentation. So now that you've got a little bit of information about who we are, we'd like to get to know a little bit more about you. So I've got a few questions here. I'm going to go through the questions one at a time, read them out, and I'll ask that you enter your answer in the chat, just so we can get an idea of who's in attendance, what level are you at, so we can make sure we're communicating the information that's going to be useful to you. So the first question I have is, how many years have you been working in state government? And you don't have to have the exact number. You can say, less than a year, between 1 to 5 years, or more than 5 years. Okay, so I see we've got a range here. We've got some less than a year. So we've got some 15 years or more. Diane, yeah, you've got a lot of years of experience with the state. Okay, so we have a pretty good range here. This training is the basic D23 fund training. So if you've been working in state government and you've been working with D23 funds for a while, this might be a little bit more of a refresher for you. But it never hurts to revisit those foundational concepts. We've still got some answers coming in here. Feel free to continue typing them if you didn't get to answer that one yet. The next question I'd like to ask is, what is your current comfort level with the D23 fund profile? So I'll give you 3 options. Low, you're not at all familiar with D23 funds. Medium, you're somewhat familiar with D23 funds, you know the basics. Or high, you're very comfortable with D23 funds, you're expecting this training is going to be a refresher for you. Seeing some lows and some mediums. Got a high in there. Okay, so we've got a pretty good mix in attendance today. So some of this might be all new information for you. It's a basic D23 fund training, so that's kind of the level we're tailored the presentation to today. Some of this might be a refresher. And if you have a lot of knowledge about this already, we do plan to have an advanced D23 fund training coming up in May. So you might be interested in that as well if you want to have a little bit more deeper dive into the D23 fund and some of the situations or questions that can come up. All right. The final question I have today is to get an idea of what you are hoping to get out of this training. We want to provide useful information. If you have specific topics or questions you want to make sure we cover today, if you could put them in the chat and I'll kind of review them during the presentation, make sure that we're covering them. If there's something we can't get to, if we have some time at the end, we can talk through it, or if it's a more advanced topic, we can make sure we include it in our advanced D23 fund training. Okay. All right, seeing some comments in there. So I'm hoping that our agenda will cover most of these things for you already. Better understanding of how they work, a refresher, learn how to set up new D23s and maintain the ones we have. Okay, so I think we're going to cover a lot of these topics already. As we go, please feel free to enter questions in the chat, and we do hope to have some time at the end just for Q&A. All right, so moving on to our agenda for today. The goal of this training is really tailored towards new SFMA users to be able to understand the basics to successfully submit D23 fund requests on behalf of your agency. And maybe you have been using SFMA for quite some time, but you haven't requested D23 funds before. So this is really designed for people that are going to be requesting D23 funds, want to be able to understand D23 funds. And for some of you, this may just be a review. So our agenda today is just to talk about what is a D23 fund. We will cover what is on the D23 screen in SFMA. Carlene will walk us through how to request a D23 fund and when and how to request a new Treasury fund if that's something you're going to need. I will talk about the difference between a Treasury fund and a cash fund. We get questions about that somewhat frequently, so I want to kind of explain what the difference between those two are. And then we'll talk about what changes can be made to a D23 once it has been submitted. Okay. So starting us off, what is a D23 fund? So a D23 fund is a very critical profile in R-Stars to account and track an agency's financial activity. The D23 fund profile is centrally maintained. And that means that as an agency, you don't have access to maintain this profile yourself. You have to request SFMS set up D23 funds. Just because it's such a critical profile, we want to make sure those get set up appropriately. And there's some things that need to be reviewed by other groups as well when we're establishing a new D23 fund. So a D23 fund is the lowest level in the R-Stars hierarchy for fund reporting. So it specifies the appropriated fund, which is used for budget tracking and reporting. It also specifies the GAAP fund for the financial statement reporting. It also specifies the Treasury fund to identify the associated Treasury account. We also have a cash fund, which is optional, which allows cash balances to be managed in R-Stars across multiple D23 funds. There's indicators that are on the D23 fund that determine how data is summarized. So there's data summarized on the 62 screen for appropriations. So we have an appropriation indicator on there. Agency budgets, you can have a financial summary on the 61 screen. So however you set up your D23 is going to control how information is summarized on that screen. And then we also have the cash control indicator, which controls how information is summarized on the 63 screen. So those indicators usually cause some questions. People aren't quite sure what to put on their D23 fund request for those. So we'll talk about those today so you can kind of get a better idea of what those indicators control. And the last thing I want to mention about a D23 fund. So typically when agencies are entering transactions in SFMA, users aren't actually inputting the D23 fund on each transaction. Most agencies are using the PCA profile, which is the SFMA 26 screen, to automatically look up the associated D23 fund rather than entering it on each individual transaction. So even though you might be more focused on the PCA when you're doing your actual transaction input, every single transaction entered in SFMA is associated with a specific D23 fund. You may not be entering it when you're inputting the transaction, but you may be entering something that looks up that D23 fund. Okay. So that is an overview of what a D23 fund is. So what is on the D23 screen? So we're going to take a quick tour of a sample D23 screen in SFMA. Carlene is going to cover some of the same information when she talks about how to request a new D23 fund a little bit later today. But before we talk about requesting a new D23 fund, I'd like to walk us through one that's already been established. So you can kind of get an idea of what information can you find out about your D23 funds just looking at the D23 screen. So if we look at this example, this is one from Agency 999, the Oregon Rainy Day Fund. So on the top line, you can see we have the agency number, we have the fiscal year, we have a fund number. And on the second line, we have the fund title. So these are pretty straightforward of what they are. Agencies, when you're requesting a new D23 fund, get to choose what fund number you want to use. So you may have specific numbering conventions that your agency uses when you're setting up funds, but it's really up to agency discretion what number you want to use for that fund. The fund title is also up to agency discretion, but it should clearly identify what type of activity will be recorded within that D23 fund. It often has a tie to the legislation that established the authority to set up the D23 fund. And then we've got several other fields on this profile, and we're going to take a closer look at a few of them on the next section of slides. Okay. So let's look at a couple of the budget related fields. So I mentioned the D23 tracks budgetary information. It does this through the appropriated fund. We also have a CC org level indicator, and this is actually related to the appropriated fund. So these would be the two budgetary fields on this D23 screen. And if you look, we've got appropriated fund of $3,600 for this D23. Right next to that, there's a statement that this must be in the D22 appropriated fund profile. So you can actually go to another screen in SFMA and get a little bit more information about that appropriated fund. So let's take a look at that for this example. So if I go to the D22 screen, I can input appropriated fund 3,600 and see that this is considered other funds non-budgeted. So the appropriated fund specifies how activity has been budgeted. So you can go to the D22, you can scroll through this screen and see all of the appropriated funds that are available at a statewide level. This D22 profile also shows you what your CC org level indicator will need to be on your D23 fund request. So if I look up 3,600, towards the bottom of the screen, I see this CC org level indicator of 1. So when I submit my D23 fund request, since I'm using appropriated fund 3,600, I also have to use a CC org level indicator of 1. If you scroll through the D22, you're going to see most of these have a CC org level indicator of 1, which is post at the agency level. The ones that don't are general fund. General fund is tracked at a higher level because it's the statewide general fund. So it will be a 0, do not post agency. So if you're requesting a D23 fund that begins with 8, all appropriated funds that begin with 8 are for the general fund, you would have a CC org level indicator of 0. Go ahead, Julie.
We have a question came in. It says, does the agency have just one appropriated fund? So maybe if you can give a little information about the appropriated funds.
Yeah, so it's going to depend on your agency, how the legislature has granted your budget. So if you've got budget staff, you could probably talk to them to see how many appropriated funds your agency use. So there's typically three main types, well, maybe four. You have other funds that you can be granted. You have general fund that you can be granted. You have federal funds, and we do have some agencies that have lottery funds as well. So it really depends what your legislatively approved budget indicates, what your agency is going to have. We have some agencies that are entirely generally funded, and they may not have any other appropriated fund types. We also have agencies that have every single different type of appropriated fund. There's specific appropriated funds related to capital construction. So it really depends on your agency. And let me know if you have follow-up questions on that, or if you want me to go into any more detail. All right, great, thanks. Thanks, Olga. Okay, so that is the budgetary fields I wanted to point out on the D23 screen. The next ones that I want to point out are related to financial reporting. So we have the gap fund. This controls how information is going to be reported in the annual comprehensive financial report, the ACFR, that SARS puts together. SARS is the statewide accounting and reporting services group. We have the GASB 54 code, which I'll talk about in a future slide. That is something else that controls how activity is closed out when we do the general ledger close program. So those are the ones I want to talk about a little bit more here. If you look at the gap fund for this example, our gap fund is 0055, and we've got that statement again of it must be in the D24 gap fund profile. So let's take a look at the D24 gap fund profile for this fund. Okay. So I can see on the D24 screen, our gap fund here, 0055, which is the GASB 54 Oregon Rainy Day Fund. Now, these D24s are managed by SARS, the statewide accounting group. They request new gap funds if necessary. They're all shared at the statewide level, so everything can be rolled up into the comprehensive financial report. You can go to the D24 screen and scroll through to see all of the different gap funds that are available. Or you could go to the Oregon Accounting Manual. I have a link on these slides, chapter 05.20.00, and it will have some additional information about these gap funds. Appendix A specifically lists all of the gap funds with descriptions of each. So you can kind of get an idea of the different gap funds that are available. Whenever we have a D23 fund request from an agency, we forward that request on to SARS, the statewide accounting reporting group, to review that the gap fund and the GASB 54 code and description is appropriate. So they're reviewing this information. It's part of our control process to make sure that when we're setting up these D23 funds, any activity that's reported to them is going to be reported correctly in the ACFR. So what about that GASB 54 code? So this is used to determine what general ledger D23 fund nominal balances. So when you're recording revenue and expenditure during the fiscal year, what equity account is that going to close to at the end of the fiscal year when we run our general ledger close program? So you can look these up on the D54 screen with a table ID of GB54 for GASB 54. The example that we were looking at had a GASB 54 code of C1, which is a committed fund balance. And we've got some information in the reference data there. It tells me that at the end of the year, when we close our books for the fiscal year, any revenue and expenditures, any nominal accounts are going to close to GL 3051. And we've got the T codes that are used to automatically do that. So this just makes sure when we're closing the books, everything is going to the right spot. There is more information on what these codes are in that Oregon accounting manual, that same section I referred to you before, OAM 05.20.00, where you can look up all of the available GASB 54 codes. And if you have questions about GAP funds or GASB 54 codes, you're not sure what you need to use, reach out to your SARS analyst. They are the expert in that. They're going to be reviewing your D23 fund request anyway before we set it up. So if you have questions on what it should be, you can reach out to them. They may ask for some additional information about the type of activity that's going to be recorded in the D23 fund. So those are the financial reporting fields I wanted to cover. The next items I'd like to highlight are the treasury and cash fields. So for our example, D23, we have the cash fund and the treasury fund. So let's start with the treasury fund. Now, the treasury fund on a D23 identifies the associated bank account at Oregon State Treasury for that D23 fund. So in this example, I can look these up on the D53 screen with the table ID TRES for Treasury. And I can look up that Treasury fund. In this case, it was 0401, and this is the general fund. So you can have multiple D23 funds that use the same Treasury fund. Legislation when you're setting up a new D23 fund may require that you set up a separate Treasury fund before you establish your D23. So Carlene will talk a little bit about that when she talks about how to set up a new Treasury fund. But there's specific language in legislation if it says that this activity needs to be recorded separate and distinct from the general fund. That means you need to have a separate Treasury fund set up for this to segregate that activity at Oregon State Treasury. So that is the Treasury fund. The other item that I wanted to mention is the cash fund. And the cash fund is optional. The one that we were looking at for our sample D23, we didn't have a cash fund. This is what the cash fund profile looks like. If you do have a cash fund, you would have it on the D73 profile. This is another central profile. You would request SFMS setup, and we would set this up if you wanted to use it on your D23 fund. So cash funds are useful if you have multiple D23 funds that all use the same Treasury fund. You might want to consider using a cash fund in SFMA. With the cash fund, SFMA is looking to see if there's enough total cash available in that cash fund when posting transactions. So you may have 3 different D23s. And if they all use the same cash fund on the 63 screen, if you look at that cash fund, it's going to sum all of the cash balances for those D23 funds when determining if you have enough cash to post a transaction. If you don't have a cash fund, SFMA is looking to see if there's enough cash available in that specific D23 fund. So it's just an option that gives you some more flexibility on managing cash in SFMA. And I'm going to talk about this a little bit more later in the presentation when I emphasize the difference between a Treasury fund and a cash fund. But I just kind of wanted to give you this preliminary information to kind of see what the difference is. Okay. So continuing our tour of the D23 screen, there is another section on summary indicators that I wanted to go over. So we've got some summary indicators here. We get lots of questions on these of exactly what should they be. There's the appropriation indicator, the agency budget indicator, and the cash control indicator. So I'll go through each of these on a separate slide. So the appropriation indicator determines the level that activity recording this D23 fund will be summarized on the 62 screen. So I've got a sample 62 screen here. The 62 screen is usually used for verifying if you have enough budget. So you're entering your agency, your appropriation year for the budget, and your appropriation number. Now, for the appropriation indicator on a D23 fund, it's always going to be 1. For the state of Oregon, it's always summarized by appropriated fund, so by 3,600. So you're not putting the individual D23 fund in on the 62 screen, you're putting in the appropriated fund. And I do see a question in the chat. My understanding is that there can be only 1 cash fund for each treasury fund. Is that correct? So I'm going to go back 1 slide here where we're talking about the cash fund. Yes, if you're setting up a cash fund on that D23 profile, it ties to 1 treasury fund. So you can only, it's a one-to-one relationship. If you want a cash fund, it has to use 1 treasury fund. So when we're saying if you have multiple D23 funds that use the same treasury fund, you can use a cash fund. If you had multiple D23 funds that had different treasury funds, you're not going to be able to create a cash fund because they are separate accounts. Good question. Now moving back, this is the appropriation indicator. So this is some explanation of it, but really what you need to know is it's always going to be 1 for your D23 funds. The next is the agency budget indicator. And here you have a couple of different options depending on how your agency uses the 61 screen. So the agency budget indicator determines what level you're summarizing information on the 61 screen. So you can put an indicator of 0. That means you're not summarizing it at a fund level at all. You're just looking it up by PCA. You're having full detail on there. You're not summarizing information to that D23 fund. If you do an agency indicator, a budget indicator of 1, it's going to summarize it at the appropriated fund level. So if you're looking on the 61 screen, you're going to have to enter the appropriated fund to see activity. 2 is the fund level that you're summarizing. This is the one we most commonly see agencies submit in their requests. So they want to use the 61 screen. They want to be able to enter the D23 fund on that screen and see all activity summarized by that fund. So take a look at your agency's D23 profile, see what you use. We have agencies that use different indicators, but 2 is the most common that we see. But if you don't use the 61 screen that much, it really doesn't make much difference then if you're pulling reports through OB to monitor activity and you're not really using this 61 screen. Okay. The final summary indicator I want to talk about is the cash control indicator. So this indicator determines how your activity is going to be summarized on the 63 screen. So there's a couple of different options here from 0 to 3. So 0 is the activity isn't summarized on the cash control screen. We only see that for government-wide reporting funds. So agencies that have a standard government-wide reporting fund, they're only used for entries for financial statement purposes. They have an appropriated fund of 9998. They'll use a cash control indicator of 0 because they're not actually touching cash. You're just making entries for financial statement purposes. An indicator of 1 summarizes it at the appropriated fund level. And we only see that with general fund appropriated funds that begin with 8. So the statewide general fund is 1 pool of money. So you're granted a general fund appropriation to be able to spend out of that general fund, but we're tracking it statewide at the appropriated fund level to see if there's enough cash. It's not tracked at the individual agency level. So if you're requesting a D23 fund and it uses a general fund appropriated fund that starts with 8, then your cash control indicator would be 1. Now, the next 2 and 3 are the most common ones we see for cash control indicators. You would use a cash control indicator of 2 for any non-general fund appropriated funds if you don't have a cash fund. So if you decided you don't need a cash fund for this D23, your cash control indicator is going to be 2. So that screenshot I have below there of the 63 screen, this is a fund that uses a cash control indicator of 2. If I want to see how much cash I have available in this fund, I go to the 63 screen, I enter the agency and the D23 fund, and that my information will be summarized there at the cash balance that's available. Now, if you have a cash fund, if you've decided to use that, you're going to have a cash control indicator of 3 on your D23 fund request. And when you go to the 63 screen, you're going to enter agency and cash fund, and you're going to leave D23 fund blank because it's summarizing cash at that higher cash fund level. So that was a quick whirlwind tour of the D23 screen. I didn't cover all of the fields. Carlene's going to talk about some of these other ones I didn't get to. But I want to open it up for questions. If anybody has any questions on any of the information I went over, please put it in the chat or raise your hand. Okay, I'm not seeing anything. Feel free, if you think of questions along the way, to enter them in the chat. I'm going to move forward to the next section and introduce Carlene Hancock. Carlene, we're about 2:30, so we're probably a little bit early for a break just yet. So I think if you want to get started on these slides, and I can kind of check and see where we are at 3 o'clock and see if we want to do a break then.
That sounds very good. Thank you, Liz. I'm taking control. Hi, everyone. My name is Carlene Hancock. I am your main contact for D23s and getting them through the review and submission process. I just wanted to let you know what I'm going to talk about, which is basically the D23 request form, the review process, and the pitfalls that agencies sometimes fall into. Catching my main purpose of review and our main purpose of review is catching mismatched elements on the request form prior to them going into production. Currently, and I wanted to say this, that currently SFMS has a practice and policy regarding errors on requested D23 request forms. We allow currently 1 to 2 errors being detected on these forms, and SFMS will contact you in using the email string for the agency as backup, requesting updated information from you. If there are only 1 or 2, we accept the form. We'll make the changes on the form. The email string is the backup to your response on that email string is the backup for that form change. If there are 3 or more errors detected on a form, then SFMS is rejecting that form, and we ask you that you make the corrections and you resubmit that D23 request form, and we will process it from there. This is the current practice at this time. However, this practice is in discussion and may be changing to a zero error policy. So just be aware that that is not the current policy, but it may be an upcoming policy. It is in discussion. So there's that. I sent a D23 request form. It looks a little weird. I wanted to discuss it really quickly. When I first started using D23s and reviewing them, I found it very helpful that the different screens related to the fields, that I recorded those for myself. So I knew exactly where that information is actually coming from. Hoping it's helpful for you, especially those that are new and don't necessarily deal with D23s requesting them on a daily basis. As Liz said, the appropriated fund comes from the D22. The gap fund is on the D24. If you have a statewide indicator, that has to be present on the D39 screen. and we're going to talk about that. The local fund indicator either needs to be an N or an S. I'll talk about that later. The GASB G54, Liz just went over that beautifully. I really don't feel like I need to touch on that again. And then the cash fund is a D73, and that needs to be requested. The cash control actually is also run off the D22. There's a cash fund indicator. If that cash fund indicator is 0, then the cash control needs to be either a 0 or a 1, 1 being the appropriated fund. If that cash fund indicator is a 1, then the cash control element needs to be a 2 or a 3. 2 for cash fund, fund, sorry. Need some water. 2 for fund, 3 for cash fund. And then the treasury fund is on the D53, and the CC org level, Liz went over beautifully, and it is also on the D22. Now, my form has the appropriation, and we do request that you put all appropriations on. That's found on the 20 under your agency for the current AY. And then all legislation, I do look up legislation, and that you can find. I tried to put the link in there. You may have to type it into your on the internet, a little HTTPS. Type it in there to come up with the legislation. So moving forward. So that's just a brief overview of the D23 request form. Okay, let's talk about, everybody wants to know how to submit a D23 and how to get it through the review process in the easiest fashion. And I'm going to give you some hints and tips. Our most current D23 form and D73 cash fund forms are fillable forms, PDF forms on the SFMS website under forms, profiles. So you can start there. We want the most current. Anything older is rejected. So if it's older than the forms that are on the website, we won't accept them. So that's one pitfall that we've been running into. So what you want to send to SFMS specifically is a completed D23 form, the newest version, the appropriate legislation or legal authority, including the section and, if appropriate, the subsection on the form so that we can identify it, because a lot of these bills are very, very large. Please don't leave it to me to find your legislation, because I'll just kick it back to you. And then if appropriate, if your agency uses them, a completed D73 form. Where does the agency send the D23 request? We have an email box and have had for about a year and a half, and it's d23.sfms@das.oregon.gov. Okay, let's talk about the different sections. Oddly enough, I start at the bottom of the request form. Who knew? I start at what is the legal legislation for this D23 fund. I am looking for the HB or SB that either starts a new program and any legal restrictions for it. I'm looking for the HB-SB with spending authority, including a section or subsection if appropriate. The ORS, if that's appropriate. E-board minutes, chapter law. If it's the Oregon Constitution, please, please, please send that section to me. I have a hard time finding that. And then the federal, the last 3 years we've had federal HR bills, which are the House of Representative bills. Basically, those are the COVID and ARPA. First year we were just accepting that. Now we're accepting those, but we also want the HB or SB or E-board spending authority with those to accompany those. So this seems to be the hardest thing. Everything starts with the legal legislation. Do you have the authority to spend these monies? Start the new program, make changes. Those kinds of things is what we're looking for. Then I start looking at the fund number requested. Now this seems awfully, this is one that you choose, your agency chooses, and hopefully you have a numbering convention that works for your agency. But I do check this as the next thing on my list, because you would be amazed at how many numbers are already in place, and they're being requested a second time. So occasionally this happens. It's not an always, but I always do. It's part of the review process. It's for me to make sure that that is a free number to use. Okay, then we look at the Treasury Fund and the local fund indicator. These are some things that can be a mismatch for the agency. And the Treasury Fund can occasionally be a source of interesting requests. Let's just put it that way. The Treasury Fund, which is the D23, needs to be open and exist at Treasury and available for use in RSTARS for the requesting agency. That's a question I ask myself. Is it available? Does it appear to be appropriate for the D23 being requested? An example for me is I'm agency 999. It's 0401. Oh, I'm only 0401, so I know don't change. Hypothetically, you could have a D23 fund for one of your programs, say Snoopy Incorporated. Well, you're doing something for Linus, and Linus has his own D53 fund, Treasury Fund. So if you're trying to use Snoopy with Linus and Linus is his own agency, that doesn't work. So I need to just make sure that everything is appropriate. Local fund indicator, it's such a small thing. It's an N or an S. And basically I'm looking for the mismatch for the Treasury Fund. If you have a regular Treasury Fund, say 1234 is a regular Treasury Fund for your agency, you requested it, it is yours. And allows a warrant, and let me finish this thought and I'll answer that question. And allows warrants to be written against that Treasury Fund. S does not. It's essentially would be with a suspense account, but even some suspense accounts, if approved, and there is approval process, can allow an N. So, but I'm looking, if a Treasury account is 999 or 8,000, local fund indicator can be N or S, generally S for suspense. But if it's a regular Treasury account, 1234, then we would want cash writing authority on it. Julie, what was that question that popped up?
Does each agency need a unique fund number? If so, how do we check other agencies to see if that fund number is in use?
Number one, yes, most agencies, if they have been directed by legal legislation. Remember, Liz talked about separate and distinct, and I'll talk about that further in upcoming conversation. General fund agencies use 0401 a lot. So that's the only account I can think of right now, other than 999, which is Oregon default or suspense account, that is open to all agencies. Other than that, if if an agency has been assigned a number, and it might be assigned through DAS, CFO's office. We just had a major bond issue sent out, and DAS CFO office helps order treasury funds for this. This is a conversation, but we'll have more about. But the answer is can be yes and can be no. And if you look at the D23 screen itself, you'll notice the TRES table. And if you pull up a number on it, say, and I'm just throwing it out there, 2220, because I know that one's been assigned, you will see an agency number on the third line with a slash and then what that treasury number is called. But that first three numbers is the agency number that treasury fund belongs to. So if you're,
I'm sorry, does the agency assign their own treasury fund number? Is that something they have to be concerned about, that that's a number already out there? Or does Treasury tell them what the number will be?
The only number, that is a conversation we'll be talking about later. So hold that question. Hold that question.
Thank you.
On D23s, on D23s, the agency assigns the number. Quick answer is no. Treasury fund numbers are run through SFMS, but we'll talk about that in a few slides. I'm just looking at the mismatch here and what can go wrong, where the treasury fund doesn't belong to the agency. The treasury fund is, they're trying to assign their own numbers because they don't know that they need to go through SFMS and a request process. And the fund indicator. Any other questions? Have I confused you more?
No other questions right now.
Okay. Now, Liz just did a beautiful job talking about this, and I want to talk about the relationship between the cash control, the treasury fund, and the cash fund. The cash control fund is regulated off the D22, as Liz indicated earlier. It's going to be a zero. General fund accounts, 8,000 specifically, I believe is a zero. But cash control is regulated off that D22. If it is a zero, then this indicator is a 0 or a 1. If it is a 1, then cash control is a 2 or a 3. Now, so cash control basically is going to be a 0 to 2, and you're not going to have a cash fund, our D73, in there. However, if you have a cash control of 3, you need to have a cash fund that needs to be populated as well. And not only does it need to be populated, it needs to be properly populated with a D73 that points directly to the treasury fund in the treasury fund field. So just know that these three are interconnected. They need to match. There's a little wiggle room here, but not a whole lot. Gap fund, GASB 54 indicator, and Gap 54 description are all ultimately reviewed by the your SARS analyst. Once I complete my review, I send them up for SARS review. If the Gap fund is 4,000 or less, or in the range of the 7,500s, there needs to be a GASB 54 indicator. I cannot tell you what that indicator should be. Please talk to your SARS analyst if you have any questions regarding that G54 indicator. I just know there needs to be an indicator. If it's between the 401 or any other number not in the 7500 scaries, then you can leave the G54 blank. You can put NA for not applicable. It doesn't need to be, nothing needs to be there, and nothing needs to be in the description. You can put something in the description if you want, either way. It's just not necessary unless it is required. If there's a G54 indicator, then there needs to be a G54 description. And it's all predicated on the GAP fund. Okay, the state fund group. Now this one, 99% of the time is 999, which is Oregon default, which is just the field has to be filled in. However, if it is another code, it needs to be present on the D39 in our stars. And most of you know, due to the pandemic of the last 3 years, we've had 3 new D39s added recently, or in the process, not necessarily recently. The COVID-19 federal stimulation package that first came through had a D39 code of 2020. I believe 2020, 21, 24 was added a year later, and that had to do with ARPA, or the American Rescue Plan Act of 2021. And then most recently, 3000 was added, Corona Response and Relief. So those 3 have been used a fair amount recently in the last few years. But like I said, 9999, Oregon default is probably going to be your go-to going forward. Let's talk about the appropriated fund, and down at the bottom, right above legal legislation, is the appropriation. Appropriated funds are on the D23 itself, and it is a required field on the D23 and must be filled in. We request and we ask that all appropriation numbers that potentially could be used or will be used or known at this time to be used against this new D23 request be put on the what appropriation number will be used for this fund. I have seen as many as 0 because the appropriated fund was such that there was no appropriation against it. I have seen as many as 16 appropriations. But what we do at this time is we look at that 20 screen and we make sure that the appropriated fund that is listed on that 20 screen on that specific appropriation is not creating a mismatch with the appropriated fund in any of your PCAs. Because the appropriation is not on the D23, the appropriation will be on the PCA. And like Liz was saying earlier, the PCA is one of the most common elements used on a transaction level. So, so we're just looking for any mismatches. Let us help you. And then almost the last thing we look at is we look at the story. You know, what is this fund going to be used for? Why are you asking for this new D23 fund? What is the revenue source? How much money do you expect to have come in? This is information that is very useful for us sometimes just to get things through the review process. So tell us your story on this D23. That's a good suggestion. As far I'm seeing the question of could it be updated and add what appropriation numbers? I will talk to Fabiola about that. That I think is a fabulous suggestion. And then last but not least, oddly enough, at the very top of the form is probably the last place I look. It's basically prepared by is nice to know, because that's probably who I'm going to be communicating with. What agency, it's always good to know that, and should be filled out, as is the date. But what I'm really looking at and really reviewing is, who is it authorized by? Is it properly authorized? Is this an accountant 3 or higher in your organization? I'm seeing, is it physically signed? Is it electronically signed? If it's physically signed or electronically signed with a signature block, I don't have to go any farther. However, if it just looks like they've someone's filled in their name as the reviewer, as a text box, or sometimes it comes through on Word. What I look at there is, are these individuals on the email string, have they indicated that they approve this D23 request fund? Is it appropriate in their eyes? So that's what I'm looking at. So going through.
Carly, we are currently at 2:58. We're about an hour in, so it might be a good time for a break. We've got about a little less than 20 slides to go. So I guess I'd ask our audience, would you like us to take a 10-minute break? If so, if you could give us a thumbs up, or if you want us to just power through, we can do that too. So I'll kind of see. I'm seeing some thumbs up. So I'm thinking we should take a 10-minute break here.
Okay.
All right, so we are at 2:58 right now. Let's plan on getting back here at 3:08 and starting again.
Okay, thank you, Liz.
Yep. Okay, we are at 3:08. So hopefully you had a chance to get up and get away from your desk for a moment, or maybe catch up on emails. But we are going to go ahead and continue our presentation. So Carlene, take it away.
Woohoo! Okay, well, the last thing I really want to say, and welcome back from your break. I had a nice, refreshing. The last thing I want to say is, what is the SFMS process for this? What are the timelines? What are our deliverables? SFMS has, I don't know, some of you may have noticed, has started a new process of a confirmation receipt going out when we receive a D23 in the email box. Generally, it's before I send it, I have a really quick eyeball to review. And if I see any glaring issues, they will be mentioned in this email. So kind of in the middle, you might see, hey, I noticed that the legal legislation isn't quite what we expected. Can you please take a look at this? This is my nudge that this really isn't probably going to pass muster at the very first hurdle. Also, rejections can happen at this time as well, because now I'm starting to look at the new legislation that's coming through from the most current legislative meetings that are happening now. I'm getting a few of you who are very on top of your stuff, and you're sending me D23s on legislation that has not been signed. Some of you have even sent it when it's still in committee, which I really, really appreciate. And I'm so glad you're on top of it and you're looking for it. But really, until the governor's signature is on it, I can't have it. I can't use it. I will accept it once a House Speaker and Senate President has signed it, and just awaiting the governor's signature, but it is still the agency's responsibility to monitor it for when that governor has signed it. I'm not monitoring them at all. That's up to you to let me know, hey, release it. I know it's on hold, release it, the governor has signed it, and then we'll go through it. It does allow me an early kind of review process, so a lot of the hurdles are already taken care of at that time, by that time. But it's really up to you to get that, to let me know when the governor has signed it. The other thing is SFMS will hold requests when there are new treasury funds to be set up at OST, as long as the setup is in 1 month. So if you're asking for setup to be 3 months out before either the legislation becomes in place, or if the Treasury Fund, I won't hold it for that. I will reject it and say, hey, when it gets in within a month, let me know. I just prefer not to hold anything longer than a month for any reason. So, any questions about that? So, expected turnaround is once I accept it and once the governor's signature is on it, the clock is started. And SFMS basically has 5 days to review and approve and get that D23 request into RSTAR. Sometimes it does take longer if issues are found. Reasons it might take longer is the governor has not signed the bill. We've already talked about that a little bit. SFMS has accepted but placed a hold on the D23 request. And as mentioned before, this is more common at the end of a regular session or even during the session, but the agency is responsible for notification. New treasury account has not been set up or crosswalked into RSTARS. So sometimes I get a treasury request and a D23 request at the same time. The egg comes first, which is the treasury fund has to be set up at treasury. It needs to be open, active, crosswalked into RSTARS. So I have to wait for that to happen and those profiles to be set up prior to the review of the D23. Documentation might be incomplete. Agency has, and we've notified the agency, but we're waiting for a response because we can't move forward. Or questions arise during final review, and the there again, when the agency is notified, I'm hoping for a quick turnaround in response so that I can get that back out and get the answer to the final reviewer as quickly as possible so that they can sign off. Because I need, at the very minimum, the SFMS final review to get it into R-stars. So I don't wait for SARS, but I do have to wait for SFMS's final review. And I am just the initial review. And then once the D23 has been entered into R-stars, your agency is going to receive one of two emails, and it's basically going to notify you that SFMS has completed the review process and the D23 has been entered into R-stars, but SARS has not finished their review. So there is a potential of a gap fund, GASB 54 indicator, or a G54 description change that they will request. Or the other one, which is, yay, it's all complete, and SFMS and SARS have completed their review, and that the D23 has been added to R-stars without issues. We will still ask you to review the D23 screen to be sure that the elements entered are as they should be and what you expected, because corrections can be made at that time, especially if it's a oopsie spelling mistake, that fingered, that's been known to happen, sorry. But once the agency has verified the D23 is appropriate and correct, they can start use of it at that time and profiles can be created. Any questions? Okay. I just want to do a quick touch base that people know about the data entry guide. I think it's a pretty good quick reference on D23s and what we're looking for. So if you go to the SFMS website, the homepage on it, you're going to see that data entry guide here. So you're looking for the data entry guide. You want specifically what relates to D23s is chapter 5. It's a descriptive profile. And then you can double click on the D23 profile and it'll take you right to that section. And I just think it contains additional information or options that may be helpful to a beginner, especially, or maybe to an agency that doesn't request a whole lot of D23s. And one of the things I find the most helpful, and I personally use a lot, is when there is a GASB 54 indicator. Although I don't review the GASB 54 description, if I see something materially wrong at that point, I can send it back to the agency saying, hey, my guess is SARS is going to ask you to update this, just be prepared. And if there are different requirements for that description that is equal to the GASB indicator. So an R1, for example, would have to have a grant number, a CFD number, a CFR reference, or another federal reference. These are things that are required by SARS and SARS reviews. I just find that little snippet really, really helpful, and kind of if I can help the agency get through that quickly and easily, I like to be able to do that. So, any questions on how to get the D23, on the D23 form itself, what I'm looking for, how to get it through review process? I think probably the best thing is when you send in your D23 request, it's really, really important and very, very helpful to your reviewer. When you include the legislation or the ORS or the emergency board, whatever you're using as backup for the legal legislation, include that in your email. Don't make me go out and look for it. I will, because I need to, and it's there. It's just not necessarily the fastest and easiest way to do things. So any questions? Okay, so I think I'll go on and talk about when and how to request a new Treasury fund. Okay, how does an agency know that they need a new treasury fund? Well, there needs to be legal legislation behind it. And the magic words really are, the legislation needs to contain the words separate and distinct from the general fund. Those are the magic words. The legislation will then go on, and almost always before those words, it'll give you the name of the new or title of that the new treasury fund should be, or really close to. And Treasury looks at this. The legislation may or may not direct where the interest is earned, and if it doesn't, generally speaking, that just let me know. No, it did not say where the interest needs to be earned. A lot of times it will indicate that the interest needs to be directed to itself. Generally, the legislation does not dictate where the fees are assessed, and that's where the agency needs to figure out if they want it to go against the fund itself, or if it wants it to be directed to another treasury fund. Treasury needs to know where the interest needs to be earned and where the fees need to be directed, and where it's appropriate. And that is, and I need that information. We also need an effective start date, needs to be determined. And when does the agency expect the funds to come in? Now, this is really, really important because you don't want to cross months, because the Treasury assesses late or the fees on the first day of the month, last day of the month that it's open. So you don't want to cross those months with that fund being open. So you either want to open on the first of the month, or anytime during that month when the fees are not fees, or when you expect the account to be funded. The closest to that you can get. How does an agency request a new fund, and is there a form for that? Currently, there's not a form. We're working on it though. So yes, currently there isn't a form. So what the agency needs to do is send an email request directly to my email address and with a CC to Liz with the following information. We need to know, what is the title of the new D23 fund? What is the legal legislation? So we need the HB, SB, ORS. I don't think I've ever seen a treasury fund come through emergency board. So those three, ORS, HB, or SB. Where is the interest going to be earned? Where does the agency want the interest to go? Where do the fees want to be paid out of? What account does the agency want those paid out of? And what is the effective start date? And when should the account be opened at Treasury? Then what happens next? I'll take that email and I'll review the request and verify the legislation, always. If questions arise, again, I will email the agency and ask the question. SFMS, once it's okayed, SFMS will then send that email forward to Treasury requesting the Treasury account after SFMS assigns the number for Treasury funds. Where the D23 fund, the agency assigned their own numbers, SFMS is responsible for assigning Treasury funds. So we'll do that, send it forward to Treasury. SFMS will email the Treasury group with all of the actors that have been on the email, and I'll add a few more. And then all contacts for the agency request will be included in the CC line. So at that point, you'll know what Treasury fund is yours and what the number will be, and you can either start on your D23 request or have it ready, put that number in, and send the D23. And then what is the timeline for that request? Well, OST has 5 days to review the request and open the new Treasury fund, or they may have questions too. 1 day to crosswalk over into the new Treasury fund from their system into our system, And then I have 1 day to get the profiles uploaded, which is basically the D24 and the LFCW into RStars. So there's 2 profiles. And then the normal turnaround is about 3 to 4 days. Treasury has been really, really quick about these lately, but I have known them to take, depending on the volume, they can take up to 5 days. So it can take as long as 7 to 8 days from request to ready for inclusion on a D23. We have found that there's terminology differences between SFMS and Treasury. Who knew? Anyway, just to give you kind of a heads up when you're talking to both of us so you're not completely confused. What we call a Treasury fund, or even we will call it a receipted account, Treasury fund, or a Treasury account. Treasury calls an agency account. What SFMS calls a suspense account, remember that 9999, or it's going to be an 8,000 number depending. Treasury calls a Treasury account or a TRS account. So I just wanted you to be aware of these terminology changes so that if you're ever talking to Treasury and you call something a Treasury account, because we call, or a Treasury fund or a Treasury account, because we call it a Treasury fund or a Treasury account, they are not the same thing. Treasury accounts at Treasury are a suspense account. Agencies accounts are a Treasury fund or Treasury account or a receipted account. So there is that. Any questions regarding new Treasury accounts? Remember, it starts all with the legal legislation. It's all derived off of that. Okay, Liz, I don't think they have any questions for me. So, yes.
All right, thank you very much, Carlene. And if anyone has questions, you can enter them in the chat. We still have another half an hour to our training, so we will probably end up a little bit under time. So we'll have time for Q&A at the end. So I'm going to move us forward to the next section here. Going back to a topic, I talked a little bit about treasury funds and cash funds. Carlene talked a little bit about treasury funds and cash funds, and now we're going to revisit again of what is the difference between a treasury fund and a cash fund. This question comes up somewhat regularly. As Carlene mentioned, there's some terminology differences. You know, sometimes you get confused. What is the cash fund versus the treasury fund? So we've just got 2 slides here to kind of emphasize that point. So a treasury fund crosswalks to a specific bank account at Oregon State Treasury. So I have a graphic here. Carlene mentioned that the OST system needs to crosswalk to RStars or SFMA. And this is kind of a behind the scenes screen in SFMA of how that crosswalk works. So I think it's kind of useful just to kind of give you a visual of how this is happening. So for this example, I'm going back to the sample D23 fund we looked at a little bit earlier today, where we had a treasury fund of 0401, which is the general fund. So if I look at this crosswalk screen, I can see our SFMS number. That's our treasury fund number of 0401. It crosswalks to treasury as 00401. So if you're used to working with Oregon State Treasury, they have a specific numbering convention they use for accounts. So to convert a treasury fund to an OST account, the format is going to be the agency. So I've got an example in this last bullet point if we're looking at what the DAS general fund treasury account would be. It's going to start with the agency number for DAS 107, followed by 2 zeros, and then a dash, and then 00401. So they have 5 digits after that dash, whereas the treasury fund is shortened to 0401. So that's what we're talking about here of how that crosswalk is happening between OST's system and between our system. So treasury fund ties directly to an account at Treasury. So the cash fund, it's an option. It's not something that's required, and it's used in SFMA for cash management. So it's only used to control cash within SFMA. Cash funds are not used by Oregon State Treasury for any purpose. So if you're talking to Treasury about cash funds, they're not necessarily going to know what you mean because that's specific to SFMA. So if your agency has multiple D23 funds that use the same Treasury fund and you have a cash fund on each of those D23 funds, cash for all of those funds are going to be pooled in SFMA when doing the edits to see if you have enough cash to be able to post a transaction. So again, here's a screenshot of the 63 screen. If you have a cash fund, you would enter your agency, your cash fund, and you would see the cash balance for all the D23 funds that use that cash fund pooled together. So hopefully that clarifies things a bit about the difference between those two fields. Okay, so we've talked a lot today about what a D23 fund is, how to request a new one, but what about maintaining D23 funds? What changes can you make once you have an existing D23 fund established? So there's only certain fields that can be changed on an existing D23 fund. So just like other SFMA profiles, when you make a change, it's not retroactive. So anything that previously posted is not going to reflect that change to the profile. Because of that, we can't go back and change things. We can't go back to an existing D23 and say, now we want to add a cash fund to it because you've already had transactions post and it's not going to update what already posted. So there's only 4 fields that we can change. We can change the fund title. We can change the GAP fund, the GASB 54 code, or the description. And those last 3 all require approval from SARS to be able to change those fields because those are used for financial reporting. So you may have a request to change one of those that would need to be approved by SARS, or SARS may reach out to you and say this needs to be changed. So those are the 4 fields that we can change on an existing D23. If you want to change any other field, if you have an indicator that wasn't set up correctly, or you use the wrong appropriated fund, you're going to have to request a brand new D23 fund. So it's really important when you're preparing these D23 requests to make sure that all the information is accurate on there, because once it's set up, we really can't change much to it. And then you're going to have to set up a new D23 fund and potentially use transactions to transfer over balances. So that's something we'd like to avoid if possible. Okay. So we have come to the end of our slides for today. We are on the questions slide. So I'm going to open it up. We still have a half an hour scheduled. So if you have questions, we can do a QA session, answer those. If we don't have any questions, we may be able to wrap up a little bit early.
Everybody's just waiting for somebody else to ask a question.
I know you have questions.
And we can definitely hang on through the end of the scheduled time to see if something comes up. You know, a lot of the times you may not know you have questions until you're actually trying to prepare it. So of course, we're always available. You can contact Carlene or myself to help answer questions as you go. We do have an advanced training that's going to be scheduled in May where we're going to go through some more advanced topics for D23s. We didn't talk about how to close out a D23. We'll be covering that in the advanced session. Also, we'll be talking about linked cash, which is not something a lot of agencies use, but it's a little bit more complicated. And we can also go into some more detail about some of the legislative authority and what we're looking for. So if you have any suggestions of topics you want to make sure that we cover in our advanced training, please, you can enter them in this chat. You can enter it after our presentation is over, because we want to make sure we're covering the information that's most useful to you.
Yes, the PowerPoint presentation will be available on the SFMS website within the week, so it should be there before the end of this week.
Okay, Liz, I'm thinking that since we don't have any questions that are coming forward, should we go ahead and close it out?
Yeah, so what I'm going to do, I hope everybody found this information useful. I will hang on for, another 10 minutes or so to see if we've got any other questions we can answer. I do see one just came up. So we have a question of, when do revenue and expenditures related to GL based on GASB 54 code get posted? Julie, I think I want a little bit more clarification. I don't know, Sangeet, would you mind if Julie can take you off of mute? If you could come off mute and give me a little bit more information on that specific question.
All right, you should be able to unmute your mic now.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, the question that I had was like when I was at SARS, that questions always kind of lingered around on my head. The question I had was that if you, let's say that, you create a new D23 fund and then you have, let's say that you have a GASB 54 code, R3 coded to it. And then after 2 or 3 months after, then you go ahead and change the GASB 54 code from like R33 to R2. And by the end of the year, when the month 13 gets closed, there were times I've seen that a portion of the transaction get closed to R2GL, which is 3042, and other transaction gets posted to 3043 R3. So I was just kind of confused, always confused that, when does if you change the GASB 54 code, like after 2-3 months during the year, how do they get posted to the appropriate GLs at what point?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I can make sure we include a little bit more of explanation in the advanced training, but I'm gonna answer it now, but I think that's a good topic for the advanced training as well. So it can occur, the GASB 54 code is used when we're closing out a fiscal year. And that kind of happens in a 2-step process. We have a process on July 1st where the system is looking to transfer beginning balances for the new fiscal year. So when it's transferring beginning balances to be populated for the new fiscal year, it's looking at that D23 profile and saying, when we close out the general ledger, where are those revenue and expenditures? What GL are they going to close to? It also looks to that D23 fund when we run our general ledger close program after month 13 ends. So sometimes I think you're talking about, sometimes you see part of it seems to move and the other doesn't. We see that if a change to the GASB 54 happens on a D23 between July 1st and the month 13 close. So whenever we're changing a GASB 54 on a D23 fund, it's good to kind of run a query and see. We may have to do some reclassification cleanup entries because if it's been around for a couple fiscal years, maybe it's been closing to GL 3051 in the past, and now we've changed the GASB 54 code and it's going to close to a different GL. There might actually have to be a reclassification entry that happens. So we see that. It doesn't happen that often. Sometimes if SARS requests a change to the GASB 54 code and it's the same fiscal year, let's say you realized in September, you set up a D23 fund, SARS asked that it be changed. Because we're outside of July 1st and month 13, it's not going to make a difference because it's not looking to that GASB 54 code until the start of the new fiscal year and after month 13 close. So I know that's a little complex. I hope that answers your question, but I do think that would be a good thing to go over in our advanced training. All right. I'm not seeing any additional questions, so thank you again for everyone. I'm happy you were able to attend. I hope this information was useful.